Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would forever change how I viewed small-town secrets. I'm Officer Marcus Thompson, 15 years with the Albany Police Department, and I thought I'd seen everything upstate New York could throw at me. I was dead wrong. "Domestic disturbance on Whitmore Avenue," dispatch crackled through my radio. "Neighbors reporting screaming, possible shots fired, backup requested." Whitmore Avenue. Even seasoned officers knew that address carried weight. The Whitmore family had lived in that massive Victorian house for over 70 years, keeping to themselves, never causing trouble. That should have been my first red flag. In my experience, families that quiet always have something to hide, something dark festering behind closed doors and drawn curtains. I pulled up to the property at midnight sharp, my patrol car's headlights cutting through the darkness that seemed to swallow the imposing three-story structure. The house looked like something from a Gothic novel, with elaborate gingerbread trim that had turned black with age and neglect. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding in long strips that fluttered in the night wind like dead skin. My partner, Officer Janet Rivers, had called in sick that evening, so I was flying solo. Protocol demanded waiting for backup on domestic calls, but something about the absolute silence emanating from that house made my skin crawl. No lights flickered behind the heavy curtains. No movement disturbed the shadows. Just dead stillness that felt wrong on every level, like the house itself was holding its breath. I radioed my position and approached the front porch, my hand instinctively checking my service weapon. The wooden steps groaned under my boots, and I noticed the railing was sticky with something I couldn't identify in the darkness. My flashlight revealed what looked like old blood, dark and crusted, but it could have been rust or tree sap. In a house this old, distinguishing between organic decay and mechanical deterioration was nearly impossible. I knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound echoing through what seemed like vast empty spaces beyond. "Police! Albany PD! Anybody home?" Nothing. Not even the sound of movement or whispered voices that usually accompanied domestic disturbance calls. Most times, by the time officers arrived, families were either in the middle of heated arguments or awkwardly pretending everything was fine. This silence was different. It was the silence of a house that had swallowed its secrets and refused to give them up. I walked around to the back of the property, my flashlight beam dancing across overgrown gardens and outbuildings that looked like they hadn't been maintained in decades. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere beneath the house, like someone hammering, but muffled by layers of wood and stone. The basement windows were boarded up from the inside, with sheets of plywood that looked like they'd been nailed in place years ago. But there was a cellar door that appeared to have been used recently. The weeds around it were trampled, and I could see fresh scratches in the metal hinges. The thumping continued, now accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices. Multiple voices, though I couldn't make out words. Someone was definitely down there, and they weren't supposed to be. I called for backup and waited what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes. Officers Patricia Coleman and Robert Hayes arrived first, followed by Sergeant William Anderson. We decided to enter through the front door, which turned out to be unlocked. Another red flag in a neighborhood where people had learned to secure their homes against the urban decay creeping in from downtown Albany. The smell hit us immediately as we crossed the threshold. Not quite death, but something organic and deeply wrong. Like meat left too long in summer heat, mixed with chemicals I couldn't identify. The house was a time capsule from the 1940s, with furniture covered in yellowing dust sheets and family portraits lining the walls in elaborate frames. But it was the portraits that made us all stop in our tracks and exchange glances that said we were dealing with something far beyond a routine domestic call. Every single photograph showed the same face. Different clothes spanning decades of fashion, different ages from childhood to elderly, but the same exact facial features repeated across 70 years of family pictures. Same sharp jawline, same deep-set gray eyes, same thin-lipped smile that looked more predatory than welcoming. It was like looking at a gallery of clones, or a family that had been breeding for specific characteristics across multiple generations. "That's impossible," Coleman whispered, voicing what we were all thinking. "Families don't look that similar across generations, not unless—" She didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. Inbreeding could produce that kind of genetic consistency, but it also produced other things: mental instability, physical deformities, psychological problems that could manifest in violence against family members or strangers. The thumping from below had stopped when we entered the house, as if whoever was down there had heard our footsteps and decided to wait. The silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. Anderson found the basement door hidden behind what looked like a pantry, concealed so well that we almost missed it entirely. The hinges screamed as we opened it, revealing wooden stairs that disappeared into absolute darkness that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. The smell got stronger as we descended, that organic, wrong smell that made my stomach turn and my sinuses burn. But underneath it was something else. Something chemical and medical that reminded me of hospitals or laboratories. I went first, service weapon drawn, flashlight in my left hand, casting dancing shadows on stone walls that looked like they'd been built when the house was constructed. The basement was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed, extending in directions that defied the property's layout. Stone corridors branched off from the main room, disappearing into darkness that our lights couldn't penetrate. And the main room was filled with workbenches, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows like an assembly line. Each one was stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify, equipped with tools and instruments that belonged in a medical facility rather than a residential basement. Hanging from the ceiling were surgical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, forceps, clamps, but not the clean, sterile kind you'd find in a hospital. These were old, worn, stained with use and time. Some looked handmade, crafted specifically for purposes I couldn't begin to imagine. But it was the far wall that made Coleman throw up and Anderson immediately radio for the State Police Crime Scene Unit. The wall was lined with glass jars, hundreds of them, arranged on shelves that extended from floor to ceiling. Each jar contained something floating in yellowish, preservative fluid. At first glance, they looked like medical specimens, the kind you might find in a university biology department. But as my flashlight beam traveled across the collection, the contents became horrifyingly clear. Human organs. Hearts, livers, kidneys, lungs, all perfectly preserved and labeled with dates and names written in careful handwriting. The dates went back to 1952, and the names were all local people I recognized from missing persons cases that had gone cold over the decades. Martha Klein, heart, liver, kidneys, March 15th, 1963. She'd been reported missing by her husband, who claimed she'd run off with a traveling salesman. The case had never been solved, and her husband had eventually remarried and moved to Florida. Tommy Valdez, complete organ set, August 7th, 1978. Teenage boy who never came home from a fishing trip to the Hudson River. Search teams had dragged the river for weeks, assuming he'd drowned and his body had been swept downstream. Jennifer Morrison, eyes, heart, reproductive organs, October 31st, 1985. College student who'd disappeared while walking home from a Halloween party. Her parents had spent their life savings hiring private investigators who never found any trace of her. The collection went on and on, representing decades of disappearances that had never been solved, never been connected, because they'd happened over such a long span of time that no one had seen the pattern. Each jar was labeled with meticulous care, as if the contents were valuable scientific specimens rather than the remains of murdered human beings. But where was the current Whitmore? And who had been making that thumping noise we'd heard from outside? Anderson found another door at the back of the basement, this one made of heavy steel and secured with multiple locks that had been opened from our side. When we pushed through, we discovered a tunnel that led to a second basement beneath what must have been a carriage house on the property. The tunnel walls were lined with more jars, smaller ones containing what looked like tissue samples and organs from children. The labels bore dates going back to the 1940s, suggesting that the Whitmore family had been harvesting human remains for 3 generations. And that's where we found him. James Whitmore, 63 years old, was standing over a metal examination table where a young woman was strapped down with leather restraints. She was conscious but drugged, her eyes unfocused and pupils dilated. She was maybe 25, with blonde hair and a face I recognized from a missing persons report filed 3 days earlier. Sarah Mitchell, last seen leaving her job at the county courthouse where she worked as a clerk. She'd been reported missing by her roommate when she failed to come home, failed to call, failed to respond to text messages. We'd been treating it as a possible voluntary disappearance, assuming she might have left town with a boyfriend or taken an impromptu vacation. Instead, she was strapped to a table in a basement laboratory, about to become the newest addition to the Whitmore family's grotesque collection. Whitmore didn't run when he saw us. He didn't even seem surprised. He just looked at us with those same deep-set gray eyes from the portraits and said, "You're early. I wasn't finished with this one yet. The preservation process requires precise timing, and interruptions compromise the quality of the specimens." The arrest was routine, but Sarah Mitchell's rescue revealed the true scope of the horror we'd stumbled into. She'd been held captive for 3 days, kept sedated while Whitmore prepared her for what he called processing. She'd been fed intravenously, kept clean and healthy, treated like livestock being prepared for slaughter. The investigation that followed revealed a horror story that spanned 4 generations and involved crimes that stretched back to the 1940s. The Whitmore family had been murdering people in their basement laboratory for over 70 years, harvesting organs for reasons that gradually became clear as we dug deeper into their records and financial history. Some of the organs were being sold to black market medical facilities that didn't ask questions about their sources. We found shipping records showing regular deliveries to research facilities in New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia, with payments totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decades. But others seemed to be kept as trophies, souvenirs of kills that had brought the family some kind of twisted satisfaction. The older jars, the ones from the 1950s and 1960s, were labeled with notes about the victims' final moments, descriptions of how they died, comments about their physical characteristics that read like a butcher's assessment of livestock. James Whitmore confessed to 17 murders over the past 20 years, describing each one in clinical detail that suggested he viewed the killings as scientific procedures rather than crimes. His father, Harold, had killed at least 30 people before his death in 1998, continuing a family tradition that had been started by his grandfather, Chester, in 1952. The most disturbing discovery came when we examined the family's detailed records, which they'd kept with the precision of scientists documenting experimental results. They'd been receiving payments from multiple medical research facilities for decades, selling fresh human organs to researchers who claimed they needed specimens for legitimate scientific purposes. The facilities had been paying premium prices for fresh specimens and asking no questions about their origin. Some of the buyers were legitimate researchers who thought they were purchasing organs from willing donors or deceased patients. Others knew exactly what they were buying and were willing to pay extra for organs harvested from healthy, unwilling victims. During interrogation, James Whitmore displayed no remorse, no understanding that what he'd done was wrong. When I asked him why he'd started killing, he looked at me like the question didn't make sense, like I was asking him why he ate food or breathed air. "It's what we do," he said, his voice completely calm and rational. "What we've always done. Father taught me, just like grandfather taught him. Someone has to provide fresh specimens for medical research. There's always demand, and we provide a valuable service. The subjects were going to die eventually anyway. We just made their deaths meaningful." The tunnels beneath the Whitmore property were extensive, connecting to basements and storm drains throughout the neighborhood. They'd been using this network to transport bodies and victims for decades, moving freely beneath the feet of law enforcement and ordinary citizens who had no idea what was happening below ground. We found evidence of at least 53 murders spanning 4 generations, with DNA evidence from the preserved organs helping us close dozens of missing persons cases, some dating back to the Eisenhower administration. Families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones finally got answers, though those answers brought no peace, only confirmation of horrors they'd never imagined. The medical research facilities in New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia were raided simultaneously, their directors arrested on federal charges. The investigation revealed that several facilities had known exactly where their specimens were coming from and had been paying the Whitmore family over $3 million across the decades for fresh human organs. But the network extended far beyond what we'd initially discovered. Financial records showed payments to and from similar facilities across the Northeast, suggesting that the Whitmore family was part of a larger organ trafficking operation that had been operating for generations. James Whitmore was sentenced to life without parole after pleading guilty to 17 counts of first-degree murder. He died in prison 3 years later, reportedly of a heart attack, though some of the guards whispered that he'd simply stopped eating and drinking, like he'd lost the will to live once he couldn't continue the family business. The Whitmore house was demolished 6 months after the arrests, but the basement laboratory was preserved as evidence for ongoing federal investigations into the organ trafficking network. The county wanted to sell the land, but no one would buy it. It sits empty now, just a foundation and some overgrown basement walls that are slowly being reclaimed by urban vegetation. Sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling that stretch of Whitmore Avenue, I'll see lights down in those basement ruins, flashlight beams moving through the darkness, or sometimes just a steady glow that suggests someone has set up battery-powered equipment down there. I tell myself it's just urban explorers looking for thrills, teenagers trying to scare each other with stories about the Whitmore murders. But I never stop to investigate. Some horrors are better left undisturbed, and the Whitmore legacy is one of them. The worst part is what we never found out. How many other families might be carrying on similar traditions in other parts of the state? The organ trafficking network extended far beyond the Whitmores, and most of those connections disappeared when the main facilities were raided. Computer hard drives were wiped, financial records were destroyed, and key personnel vanished before federal agents could arrest them. Sometimes I wonder if there are other houses, other families, other basement laboratories full of jars and workbenches, carrying on traditions that no one should ever carry on. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m., I wonder if we really stopped the Whitmore legacy, or if we just cut off one branch of something much larger and darker. The federal investigation into the organ trafficking network lasted 2 years and resulted in 17 additional arrests across 6 states. But prosecutors estimated that we'd uncovered less than 20% of the overall operation, which had been moving human organs through legitimate medical channels for over half a century. Sarah Mitchell survived her ordeal, but was never the same. The drugs Whitmore had given her caused permanent neurological damage, and the psychological trauma of knowing she'd been minutes away from being murdered and harvested for her organs left her unable to function in normal society. She moved to California to live with relatives and hasn't spoken publicly about her experience since the trial. That's the thing about family secrets in urban environments. You never know how deep they go until you start digging. And once you start digging, you might not like what you find at the bottom. The Whitmore family had been pillars of their community for generations, quiet people who kept to themselves and never caused trouble. No one suspected that they were operating a murder laboratory beneath their Victorian mansion, selling human organs to the highest bidder. The case changed how Albany PD investigates missing persons reports, especially when they occur in clusters or patterns that might suggest serial activity. We now coordinate with federal agencies from the beginning, cross-reference disappearances with organ trafficking investigations, and pay special attention to families or individuals who have been in the same location for multiple generations without much outside contact. But the Whitmore case also taught me that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary houses, contributing to their communities and raising their children to carry on family traditions that should never be carried on. James Whitmore's nephew, David, was 23 when his uncle was arrested. He'd been living in the house, helping with what he thought was legitimate medical research. The investigation revealed that David had been gradually introduced to the family business, starting with simple tasks like maintaining equipment and disposing of waste materials. By the time he understood what he was really doing, he was too involved to escape without implicating himself in multiple murders. He cooperated with investigators and received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony that helped convict several organ trafficking network members. David Whitmore served 8 years in prison and was released on parole in 2018. He lives under a new identity in another state, working as a maintenance technician and trying to build a life that has nothing to do with his family's legacy of horror. Sometimes I wonder if he's really escaped, or if the Whitmore tradition will eventually call him back to continue work that his family believed was too important to abandon. They don't teach you about the smell in police academy. Sure, they mention decomposition, show you photographs that make rookie cops lose their lunch, explain the stages of human decay like it's just another subject to master. But they can't prepare you for that moment when you're standing in the middle of absolute wilderness at 2 a.m., surrounded by pine trees and darkness so complete it swallows sound, breathing in the sweet, sick stench of death while trying not to contaminate a crime scene that might hold the key to stopping a killer. I'm Officer Patricia Hayes, New York State Police, assigned to the Albany Barracks and responsible for patrol coverage across 3 counties that most people couldn't find on a map. 15 years of processing crime scenes, from downtown drug busts to highway accident fatalities. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for what we found in the Pine Barrens that October night. The call came through dispatch at 11:30 p.m., crackling with static from the remote location. Hikers had found something unusual about 3 miles off the Northville Placid Trail, in a section of wilderness so isolated that most experienced outdoorsmen avoided. The area had a reputation among locals, hunting accidents that couldn't be explained, campers who'd gone missing and turned up weeks later with stories they refused to tell, sounds in the darkness that didn't match any known wildlife. There's something out here," the caller had stammered, his voice shaking with more than cold. "Multiple somethings. Jesus Christ. What kind of monster does this to people?" I was 40 minutes away when the call went out, driving back from a domestic violence arrest in Schenectady. My equipment van was loaded with crime scene processing gear, and I had a bad feeling about what waited for me in those woods. Isolated locations meant challenging evidence collection. No power, no laboratory facilities, no backup within reasonable response time. And if it was as bad as the hiker suggested, we'd be working a scene that could take days to process properly. Officer Raymond Murphy from Major Crimes was first on scene, along with 2 local police officers who had hiked in with emergency lighting and crime scene tape. They'd managed to secure the immediate area, but I could tell from the radio chatter that something was seriously wrong, something that went beyond routine death investigation. "Hayes, you need to get here fast." Murphy's voice crackled through my radio, tense with barely controlled emotion. "And bring every evidence collection kit you've got. All of them. And call the State Police Crime Scene Unit. Hell, call the FBI. We're going to need help with this one." The trailhead was an hour from the nearest town, down a dirt road that barely qualified as navigable by passenger vehicle. I had to hike in the final 2 miles, carrying cases of equipment through darkness thick enough to swallow my flashlight beam. Pine trees towered overhead like cathedral pillars, blocking out stars and creating a canopy so dense that even moonlight couldn't penetrate to the forest floor. My boots crunched through layers of dead needles and fallen branches, each step echoing in the vast silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Every shadow looked like it might hide something terrible. Every sound suggested movement just beyond the range of my vision. The crime scene was in a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked out the sky and created a natural amphitheater. Generator lights had been set up, casting harsh white illumination that made everything look like a nightmare movie set. And that's when I saw what had made the hikers call 911, what had shaken experienced police officers badly enough to request immediate backup. Bodies. 7 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around a stone fire pit that looked like it had been built decades ago. But these weren't recent deaths. My forensic training kicked in immediately, and I could see that we were dealing with multiple time frames. Some bodies were little more than skeletons picked clean by scavengers. Others showed various stages of decomposition, and the newest victim couldn't have been dead more than a week. The arrangement was deliberate, ritualistic, methodical. Each body was positioned facing the center of the circle, arms crossed over the chest in identical poses that suggested careful placement rather than natural death positions. Someone had been bringing victims to this location for months, maybe years, creating a macabre collection in the middle of nowhere. "Hayes, it gets worse," Murphy said, his voice tight with barely controlled nausea. "A lot worse." He was right. Beyond the immediate circle, we found evidence of more bodies. Bones scattered by animals, clothing fragments caught on branches, personal effects buried in shallow holes or hidden beneath piles of stones. The clearing hadn't just been a dumping ground. It had been an active killing field for much longer than the 7 intact bodies suggested. The forensic challenges were immediate and overwhelming. Multiple victims across different time periods, evidence scattered across a wide area by weather and scavengers, no way to power the specialized equipment needed for proper scene analysis, and the constant knowledge that whoever had created this horror show might return to admire their work or add to their collection. Everything had to be done by hand, using portable tools and techniques that belonged in a museum rather than a modern criminal investigation. No DNA sequencers, no computerized databases, no laboratory facilities closer than Albany. Just basic evidence collection, careful documentation, and the hope that we could gather enough information to identify the victims and track down their killer. I started with photography, documenting every inch of the scene before anything was moved or disturbed. My camera flash seemed obscenely bright in the wilderness darkness, each shot illuminating details that made the horror more real and more personal. Victim 1 appeared to be a middle-aged man, maybe 6 months dead based on decomposition patterns and insect activity. He was wearing hiking clothes that suggested he'd been outdoors when he died. Boots, cargo pants, flannel shirt, backpack still strapped to his shoulders. No obvious cause of death from external examination, but positioning of the body suggested he'd been arranged post-mortem. Victim 2 was a woman, younger, perhaps in her 20s. The body was more severely decomposed, suggesting she'd been here at least a year. Her clothing was inconsistent with hiking gear. She was wearing a waitress uniform from a restaurant chain, complete with name tag that read, Jennifer. Someone had taken her from her workplace, brought her to this remote location, and added her to their collection. The pattern continued around the circle. Different ages, different backgrounds, different time periods of death, but they all shared characteristics that made my blood run cold. Each body showed evidence of careful preparation. Hair had been combed and arranged neatly. Clothing had been straightened and positioned precisely. Hands had been folded in identical positions across the chest. Someone had taken time and care with these victims, treating them like dolls in some twisted collection rather than human beings who had been murdered. Evidence collection in wilderness settings is a nightmare under the best circumstances. No tables, no climate control, no sterile environment, no laboratories nearby for immediate analysis. Everything has to be bagged, tagged, and transported out by hand while maintaining chain of custody protocols that weren't designed for crime scenes 3 miles from the nearest road. But the real challenge was the sheer scope of what we were dealing with. As we expanded our search perimeter, we kept finding more evidence. Bone fragments scattered by scavengers, some showing cut marks that suggested dismemberment. Personal effects, wallets, jewelry, car keys, cell phones, buried in shallow holes around the clearing or hidden beneath piles of stones arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic significance. And most disturbing of all, a notebook hidden in a waterproof container beneath a cairn of stones near the fire pit. The notebook contained entries dating back 3 years, written in neat, careful handwriting that belonged to someone who was proud of their work. Someone who viewed murder as an art form worthy of detailed documentation. Each entry described a victim, their name, age, where they'd been taken from, how they'd been transported to the clearing, how they'd died, and how their body had been positioned in the collection. The killer had been keeping a trophy log, documenting each murder with the precision of a scientist recording experimental results. Michelle Rodriguez, 34. Waitress at Danny's Diner in Johnstown, taken from employee parking lot after closing shift on March 15th. Chloroform administered in vehicle, transported unconscious to collection site. Strangulation with ligature, approximately 4 minutes until unconsciousness, 7 minutes until death. Positioned between Thomas and Jennifer, facing east toward sunrise. Decomposition proceeding normally. Collection enhanced by diversity of age and background. The entries went on for pages, describing 23 different victims over a 3-year period. Not all of them were in the clearing. Some had been disposed of elsewhere. Some had been kept for longer periods before being brought to the woods. Some had been used for what the killer described as experimentation before being added to the main collection. The forensic work continued through the night and into the next day, with additional personnel hiking in as word spread through law enforcement channels that we were dealing with something unprecedented. We had to establish a temporary command post in the nearest town, coordinating with the State Police Crime Scene Unit, the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, and forensic specialists from the State Medical Examiner's Office. DNA collection from severely decomposed remains is challenging under laboratory conditions. In a wilderness setting, it becomes almost impossible. Contamination from environmental sources, degradation from weather exposure, interference from insects and scavengers, and the sheer logistics of properly preserving samples while hiking them out of the woods. Every step of the process presented problems that could compromise the investigation. But we got lucky with the killer's notebook. The waterproof container had preserved not just the written entries, but also photographs. Polaroid snapshots showing each victim before and after death, along with pictures of the killer arranging bodies in the clearing. The photos didn't show the killer's face clearly, but they provided crucial evidence about methodology, timeline, and the psychological profile of someone who was organized, methodical, and completely lacking in empathy for human suffering. The breakthrough came when we matched DNA from the most recent victim to a missing person report filed 5 days earlier. Thomas Brennan, 28, had been reported missing by his girlfriend after he failed to return from a solo hiking trip in the Adirondacks. The location where he'd planned to hike was over 50 miles from our crime scene, suggesting the killer was mobile, possibly intercepting victims across a wide geographical area and transporting them to his collection site. Cross-referencing the names in the killer's notebook with missing person reports from the past 3 years revealed a pattern that no one had noticed before because it had been deliberately obscured. All 23 victims had been reported missing from different jurisdictions: state police, county sheriff's departments, municipal police forces. No single agency had seen enough cases to recognize that a serial killer was operating in the region. The killer was smart, deliberately spreading his activities across jurisdictional boundaries to avoid detection. He was also patient, sometimes keeping victims alive for days or weeks before killing them and adding them to his collection. The notebook entries suggested he had a holding facility somewhere, a place where he could keep people until he was ready to transport them to the woods for the final ceremony. We worked the forensic evidence for 8 weeks, using every technique available to modern criminal investigation: DNA analysis, dental records, forensic anthropology, entomology studies to establish time of death, soil analysis to determine if bodies had been moved from other locations. The killer had left traces at the scene: hair fibers caught on tree branches, footprint impressions in muddy areas around the clearing, even fingerprints on some of the personal effects he'd buried as trophies. The forensic profile that emerged was of a man, probably in his 40s or 50s, with access to reliable transportation and enough physical strength to carry unconscious victims through difficult terrain. He was methodical, organized, and had extensive knowledge of wilderness areas that suggested either professional outdoor experience or a lifetime of hunting and camping in remote locations. But the break in the case came not from forensics, but from old-fashioned police work combined with modern technology. A traffic camera near one of the abduction sites had captured footage of a pickup truck leaving the area at approximately the right time. The image quality was poor, but license plate enhancement technology allowed us to identify the vehicle. The truck was registered to Martin Caldwell, 47, unemployed logger from a small town near the Canadian border. He owned property in the wilderness, had a history of minor arrests for trespassing and poaching, and most importantly, had been issued hunting licenses for the same region where we'd found the bodies. Caldwell's background fit the profile perfectly. Divorced, socially isolated, familiar with wilderness areas, physically capable of the crimes we were investigating. But when we tried to locate him for questioning, we discovered that he'd disappeared 2 weeks earlier, around the same time that Thomas Brennan's body had been added to the collection. The manhunt for Martin Caldwell lasted 6 weeks and involved multiple agencies across 3 states. We found his abandoned truck in a rest area near the Vermont border, but there was no trace of where he might have gone from there. The truck had been wiped clean of fingerprints and DNA evidence, suggesting that Caldwell knew we were closing in and had taken steps to cover his tracks. But Caldwell had made one crucial mistake. GPS data from his truck's navigation system showed that he'd been visiting the Pine Barrens clearing regularly for over 3 years, always at night, always during the new moon when darkness would provide maximum concealment. The data also showed visits to other locations that turned out to be additional body disposal sites. When we raided Caldwell's property, we found the holding facility, a reinforced bunker beneath his cabin, equipped with cages, chains, and supplies for keeping people alive for extended periods. We also found victim 24, a college student named Amy Foster, who had been missing for 2 weeks and was still alive, though severely traumatized and malnourished. Amy's rescue provided crucial information about Caldwell's methods and psychological state. He'd kept her in the underground bunker while he prepared her for what he called joining the collection. He described the other victims in detail, explaining how each one had been selected, captured, and eventually killed. He'd treated the murders as artistic creation, claiming that he was building something beautiful and permanent in the wilderness. The search for Caldwell ended 3 months later when hikers found his body in a remote canyon in Vermont. He'd died from a gunshot wound to the head, with his rifle found nearby in what appeared to be suicide. But the medical examiner's report raised questions about the trajectory of the bullet and the position of the weapon that suggested the death might not have been self-inflicted. The case officially closed with Caldwell's death, but questions remained about whether he'd been working alone or as part of a larger network. The sophistication of his holding facility, the professional quality of his body disposal methods, and the geographic scope of his hunting ground suggested resources and knowledge that might have come from outside sources. Financial records showed that Caldwell had been receiving regular payments from an unknown source, wire transfers that originated from offshore accounts and couldn't be traced to their ultimate source. The payments had been substantial, enough to support his activities and fund the construction of his underground facility. Amy Foster survived her ordeal but was never able to provide a complete account of what had happened to her. The trauma had left her with severe PTSD and memory problems that made her testimony unreliable. She moved to California to live with relatives and has refused all requests for interviews or follow-up questioning. The Pine Barrens clearing was preserved as a crime scene for 2 years, while federal investigators continued to search for connections to other serial killer cases. Eventually, the area was restored to its natural state, but hikers and hunters still avoid the location. Local guides tell stories about strange sounds and unexplained phenomena in that part of the wilderness. The case changed how New York State Police investigate missing persons reports in wilderness areas. We now have specialized equipment for remote forensic work, better coordination between agencies for cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries, and protocols for handling serial killer investigations that involve multiple victim disposal sites. But the Caldwell case also revealed the vulnerability of people who venture into isolated areas without adequate communication or safety planning. Most of his victims had been solo hikers or campers who had told no one about their exact plans or expected return times. They'd simply vanished into the wilderness, and no one had known where to look for them. Sometimes I drive past the access road that leads to the Pine Barrens clearing, usually late at night when I'm ending a shift and thinking about the cases that never really end. The road is gated now, with warning signs that keep most people away from the area. But sometimes I see fresh tire tracks in the dirt, or camping equipment that suggests someone has been spending time in those woods. I tell myself it's just people who don't know the history of the place, urban explorers or hunters who are drawn to remote areas by the challenge of accessing difficult terrain. But I never stop to investigate. Some places hold too much darkness, and some crime scenes are better left undisturbed. The Pine Barrens are vast and deep, thousands of acres of wilderness where a person could disappear forever without leaving any trace. Who knows what other secrets they might be hiding in their remote clearings and hidden valleys? What other collections might be waiting for discovery by some unlucky hiker who takes the wrong trail on the wrong night? That's the thing about wilderness crimes. They can stay hidden for decades, until weather or animals or sheer chance exposes what was meant to stay buried forever. And once you've seen what humans are capable of when they think no one is watching, when they believe the wilderness will keep their secrets safe, you never look at empty forests the same way again. The Caldwell investigation taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, wearing the face of a quiet neighbor or a helpful stranger who offers assistance to people in vulnerable situations. Martin Caldwell had been invisible to law enforcement for 3 years, moving freely through communities and wilderness areas while building his collection of human trophies. He'd been patient, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. His victims had been chosen carefully. People who wouldn't be missed immediately, travelers passing through unfamiliar areas, individuals who had minimal social connections or family ties. He'd studied their routines, identified their vulnerabilities, and struck when they were most isolated and defenseless. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts described Caldwell as a highly organized killer who derived satisfaction from control and domination rather than sexual violence. His victims had been killed quickly and efficiently, suggesting that murder was a means to an end rather than the primary source of gratification. The real pleasure came from arranging and maintaining his collection, visiting the clearing to admire his work and plan future additions. But what disturbed investigators most was the evidence that Caldwell had been escalating his activities. The time intervals between murders had been decreasing, and his notebook contained detailed plans for expanding his collection site and developing new methods for victim acquisition. If he hadn't been stopped, the body count would have continued climbing indefinitely. The financial investigation into Caldwell's offshore funding led to connections with similar cases in other states, remote areas where organized serial killers had been operating with resources that suggested external support. The FBI opened a broader investigation into what they termed wilderness harvesting networks, organized groups that used isolated locations to conduct activities that would be impossible in populated areas. Amy Foster's testimony, limited though it was by trauma and memory loss, provided insights into the psychological techniques Caldwell had used to control his victims. He'd been skilled at psychological manipulation, convincing people that their survival depended on cooperation with his plans. He'd described his activities as scientific research, claiming that he was conducting important work that would benefit humanity in ways his victims couldn't understand. The underground facility at Caldwell's property was more sophisticated than initial reports had suggested. Forensic analysis revealed that it had been constructed over several years, with professional-grade ventilation systems, soundproofing, and security measures that suggested extensive planning and significant financial investment. The construction quality was beyond what an unemployed logger could have afforded or accomplished alone. Tool marks and construction materials found at the site were traced to suppliers in 3 different states, suggesting that Caldwell had been careful to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention from law enforcement. The facility had been designed to hold multiple victims simultaneously, with separate containment areas and medical equipment that could keep people alive and healthy for extended periods. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed architectural plans for expanding the facility, including blueprints for additional underground chambers and equipment for what the plans described as long-term specimen maintenance. Caldwell hadn't just been collecting victims for immediate gratification. He'd been building infrastructure for a much larger operation. The investigation into Caldwell's death in Vermont revealed inconsistencies that federal investigators were never able to resolve satisfactorily. The weapon used was not registered to Caldwell, and gunshot residue patterns were inconsistent with suicide. Security camera footage from nearby hiking trails showed at least 2 other individuals in the area during the time frame when Caldwell died, but the image quality was too poor for identification. The possibility that Caldwell had been eliminated by associates who viewed him as a security risk was never officially confirmed, but it remained a working theory among investigators who continued pursuing leads related to the wilderness harvesting network. If Caldwell had been part of a larger organization, his death might have been intended to prevent him from providing information that could compromise other operations. 2 years after the Pine Barrens case closed, similar crime scenes were discovered in remote areas of Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. The victim arrangements, body positioning, and evidence collection methods were identical to what we'd found at Caldwell's clearing. Either someone was copying his techniques, or the network he'd been part of was continuing its activities with new personnel. The main case involved 12 victims arranged in 2 concentric circles around an ancient stone altar that predated European settlement of North America. The killer had been using indigenous ceremonial sites for his activities, desecrating sacred locations that had been used for peaceful purposes for thousands of years. Vermont investigators found 15 bodies in a natural cave system that had been modified with artificial lighting and ventilation. The cave showed evidence of regular use over several years, with sleeping areas and food storage that suggested the killer had been living on site while conducting his activities. New Hampshire's discovery was the most disturbing. 23 victims buried in individual graves arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around a central monument that the killer had constructed from stones taken from each victim's original burial site. The monument contained artifacts taken from the victims, jewelry, clothing fragments, personal items that had been incorporated into a twisted memorial to the killer's achievements. All 3 cases shared characteristics with the Pine Barrens murders, but none could be definitively linked to Martin Caldwell or to each other. The killers had learned from law enforcement techniques used in the Caldwell investigation, taking steps to eliminate DNA evidence, avoid creating traceable patterns, and minimize the risk of discovery. The multi-state investigation into wilderness harvesting networks has continued for over a decade, with federal task forces dedicated to identifying and disrupting organized groups that use remote locations for criminal activities. But the scope and sophistication of these networks has proven difficult to penetrate, and most cases remain unsolved. What we learned from the Pine Barrens case was that modern serial killers are adapting their methods to exploit the vast wilderness areas of the Northeast, using technology and organization to operate on scales that would have been impossible for previous generations of killers. They're patient, well-funded, and extremely careful about avoiding detection. They're also still out there, somewhere in the millions of acres of forest that stretch from New York to Maine, building their collections and perfecting their techniques while law enforcement struggles to keep up with methods that exploit the fundamental challenges of investigating crimes in remote locations. I still patrol the back roads that provide access to wilderness areas, still respond to missing persons reports that might involve people who've vanished into forests that could hide evidence forever. But the Caldwell case changed how I approach these investigations, making me aware that disappearances that seem random or accidental might actually be the work of highly organized predators who've learned to use the wilderness itself as their weapon. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving past trailheads and access roads that lead into empty forest, I think about the victims we found in that clearing. They'd been people with lives and dreams and families who loved them, reduced to trophies in a madman's collection. They'd trusted that the natural world would provide them with recreation and solitude, never imagining that it might also provide them with death. That's the reality of modern policing in areas where civilization meets wilderness. We're not just dealing with urban crime or domestic disputes or traffic violations. We're also facing predators who've learned to exploit the vast, empty spaces where people go to escape from the modern world, only to discover that evil has learned to hide in the same places they seek for peace and renewal. The first body dropped on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Friday we had 6 more. Welcome to spring in the South Bronx, where gang territory lines get drawn in blood and redrawn every few months when someone decides they need more corners, more respect, or more revenge against enemies who might be living 3 blocks away or 3 generations deep in family feuds that nobody remembers starting. I'm Officer Carlos Martinez, NYPD Gang Intelligence Division, and I've been working these streets for 12 years. Long enough to know that when bodies start piling up this fast, you're not looking at random violence or simple territorial disputes. You're looking at war, orchestrated by someone with resources and intelligence that go way beyond street-level gangbangers fighting over drug corners. The call came in at 6:15 a.m., body in Van Cortlandt Park, near the basketball courts where kids would normally be shooting hoops in a few hours. Instead, they'd be finding Michael Trips Torino, 19 years old, with 3 bullets in his chest and gang colors that marked him as a member of the Albany Street Diablos, one of the most established crews in the Bronx. Trips wasn't just any soldier. He was the nephew of Ramon Torino, shot caller for the Diablos and a man who'd been building his crew's territory for the past 8 years through a combination of violence, intimidation, and business partnerships that kept money flowing and competitors at bay. Finding him dead in neutral territory meant someone was sending a message that couldn't be ignored, a declaration of war that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. The crime scene told a story before we even started collecting evidence. Trips had been executed, forced to his knees, shot once in the back of the head, then twice in the chest to make sure he stayed down. Professional work, not the sloppy drive-by shooting you usually see with street beefs between crews who care more about making noise than making hits. Someone with military or law enforcement training had done this killing. Someone who understood ballistics and crime scene management well enough to make sure we'd find exactly what they wanted us to find, and nothing more. My partner, Officer Maria Gonzalez, arrived as the medical examiner was loading the body into the van that would take it to the morgue for autopsy. She took one look at the scene, the precise placement of the shell casings, the lack of witnesses despite heavy foot traffic in the area, the complete absence of evidence that might lead to identification of the shooter, and shook her head with the resignation of someone who'd seen this movie before. "This is going to get ugly," she said, lighting a cigarette despite department regulations about smoking at crime scenes. "Diablos won't let this slide, especially not Ramon's nephew. We're looking at full-scale war before the week's out." She was right, but neither of us could have predicted just how ugly it would get, or how quickly the violence would spiral beyond anything we'd seen in 12 years of gang enforcement in the most dangerous precincts of New York City. Body number 2 turned up that afternoon. Kevin Park, 17, member of the Golden Dragons, a Korean crew that had been expanding north from Manhattan into traditional Hispanic territory around Yankee Stadium. Park was found in a dumpster behind a grocery store on 149th Street, beaten so severely that we needed dental records to make positive identification. The beating had been methodical, professional, designed to send a specific message to anyone who found the body. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment violence or retaliation killing motivated by anger. Someone was orchestrating events, playing different crews against each other with surgical precision and military-level tactical planning. 2 crews, 2 bodies, same day. The pattern was emerging, but it wasn't the simple tit-for-tat retaliation we usually saw in gang wars, where crews responded to attacks with immediate counterattacks that escalated until everyone involved was either dead or in prison. Someone was manipulating the violence, timing the killings to maximize conflict between established organizations, while remaining invisible to law enforcement surveillance that should have detected patterns in the attacks. Bodies 3 and 4 came Wednesday night, escalating the conflict to levels that threatened to spill over into civilian casualties. Luis Herrera and David Kim, both low-level dealers from competing organizations, found shot to death in a stolen car on the major Deegan Expressway. The car had been torched after the killings, but not enough to destroy the evidence we needed to connect the murders to the ongoing pattern. Ballistics showed that all 4 victims had been killed with the same gun, a 9mm Glock that wasn't registered in any database we could access. Professional weapon, probably stolen from law enforcement or military sources, used by someone who understood the importance of maintaining consistent patterns while avoiding traceable evidence. The killer was professional, but the victims were being chosen to maximize conflict between established crews that had been maintaining relative stability in their territories for several years. Someone was deliberately destabilizing the gang structure in the South Bronx, and they were using techniques that went far beyond street-level criminal knowledge. By Thursday morning, the streets were electric with tension that you could feel in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Diablo soldiers were wearing their colors openly, something they hadn't done since the last major crackdown 3 years ago when federal authorities had arrested 24 crew members in coordinated raids that had taken months to plan and execute. Golden Dragons were fortifying their corners with extra muscle, pulling soldiers off other assignments to defend territory that had never been seriously threatened before. Word was spreading through the underground networks that a war was coming, and everyone needed to choose sides or risk being caught in crossfire that could kill anyone wearing the wrong colors in the wrong neighborhood. Street-level informants were reporting weapons purchases that went far beyond the usual handguns and assault rifles that crews normally used for protection and intimidation. Someone was buying military-grade equipment, body armor, night vision devices, communications gear that suggested coordination of activities across multiple locations simultaneously. That's when body number 5 changed everything and revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. Anthony "Tank" Morrison, 34, wasn't affiliated with any of the crews that had been hit during the week's violence. He was freelance muscle, the kind of guy who'd work for whoever paid best and didn't ask too many questions about the legality of the work involved. Tank had a reputation for discretion and competence that made him valuable to people who needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. Finding him dead in the basement of an abandoned building in Morrisania suggested that our killer was cleaning up loose ends, eliminating people who might have information about the orchestrated hits that were tearing the South Bronx apart. Tank had been tortured before he died, cigarette burns on his arms and chest, fingernails pulled out with pliers, clear evidence that someone had been looking for specific information and had been willing to use extreme methods to get it. The killer wanted to know what Tank knew about the coordination of the gang war, and Tank had eventually told him everything. The breakthrough came when we processed Tank's cell phone, which had been left at the scene in what appeared to be careless oversight but was probably intended to provide us with information that would advance the killer's agenda. Most of the recent calls were to numbers we couldn't trace, probably burner phones that had been discarded after use. But there were several calls to a legitimate business that opened up an entirely new direction for our investigation. Pinnacle Security Consulting, a private military contractor based in Westchester County, specializing in what their website described as high-risk security solutions for businesses operating in challenging environments. Their corporate literature was full of doublespeak about threat assessment and risk mitigation. But when we dug deeper into their actual operations, we found a company that employed former military specialists with expertise in urban warfare and psychological operations. The connection clicked when we cross-referenced Pinnacle's client list with recent real estate developments planned for the South Bronx. 3 major construction projects were scheduled to break ground in the next 6 months, all of them requiring the displacement of current residents and businesses, all of them in areas currently controlled by street crews that would resist any attempts at gentrification that threatened their economic base. Someone was using Pinnacle Security to eliminate the gang infrastructure that might interfere with development plans worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Not by arresting crew members through legitimate law enforcement channels, not by negotiating with community leaders through legal processes, but by starting a war that would decimate all the major players and leave valuable territory wide open for redevelopment. Body number 6 was Ramon Torino himself, found Friday morning in his own apartment with a single bullet wound to the head, killed in a location that should have been impregnable to outside attack. The killer had walked past 3 layers of security, eliminated the most protected man in the Diablo's organization, and vanished without leaving any evidence except the same 9mm signature we'd been tracking all week. Ramon's apartment was a fortress, equipped with steel doors, bulletproof windows, and security cameras that covered every approach to the building. His bodyguards were experienced soldiers who'd survived years of gang warfare, and his neighbors were all crew members who would have noticed and challenged any strangers in the area. But the killer had penetrated all these defenses without triggering alarms or creating disturbances that would have attracted attention from law enforcement surveillance teams that had been monitoring the building for years as part of ongoing gang intelligence operations. With Ramon dead, the Diablos fractured immediately along lines that had been invisible when strong leadership held the organization together. His lieutenants started fighting each other for control of territory and business operations, while foot soldiers defected to rival crews or went independent and started freelance operations that brought them into conflict with established territorial boundaries. The organization that had controlled 12 blocks of prime South Bronx territory simply collapsed overnight, leaving a power vacuum that smaller crews immediately tried to fill through violence that made the previous week's casualties look like minor disagreements. The Golden Dragons tried to move into the territory left vacant by the Diablos' collapse, but they walked into an ambush on Melrose Avenue that left 4 more bodies in the street, and their leadership scattered to the wind like leaves in a hurricane. The ambush had been planned with military precision, using tactics and equipment that suggested professional military training rather than street-level gang experience. By the weekend, the territory that had been controlled by 2 major crews was up for grabs, with a dozen smaller groups fighting over individual corners in conflicts that generated more violence in 72 hours than the area had seen in the previous 3 years combined. Mission accomplished, from the perspective of whoever had hired Pinnacle Security to destabilize the gang structure that stood between developers and profitable real estate ventures. The investigation into the private military connection took 8 weeks and involved federal agencies that don't usually get involved in local gang violence. What we found was a network of developers, city officials, and private contractors who had been systematically destabilizing neighborhoods to facilitate upscale development projects that would generate enormous profits for investors with the political connections necessary to navigate complex zoning and permitting processes. The gang wars weren't random violence erupting from cultural conflicts or drug trade disputes. They were urban warfare conducted by military professionals on behalf of real estate interests worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The street crews had been outmaneuvered by opponents who fought with tactics learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, using psychological operations and precision strikes to achieve strategic objectives that went far beyond anything the crews could have anticipated or defended against. But the killing didn't stop when we made the connection between the violence and the development projects that would benefit from territorial destabilization. Bodies kept dropping throughout April and May, as smaller crews fought for control of the territory left vacant by the destruction of the Diablos and Golden Dragons. The power structure that had maintained relative stability for years was gone, replaced by chaos that made the streets more dangerous for everyone: residents, business owners, police officers, and the gang members themselves who were dying in conflicts they didn't understand. We arrested Marcus Thompson, a former Army Ranger employed by Pinnacle Security, after matching his DNA to evidence collected from Tank Morrison's torture session. Thompson confessed to 6 of the killings during the initial week of violence, but claimed he was following orders from supervisors at Pinnacle who had contracted him to neutralize obstacles to legitimate business development. Thompson described a systematic campaign to eliminate gang leadership through targeted assassinations designed to create maximum instability in crew hierarchies. The plan had been developed by military intelligence specialists who understood how to destroy organizational structures through precision strikes against key personnel. The company denied any involvement in the murders, claiming Thompson had gone rogue and acted without authorization from supervisors who had hired him only for legitimate security consulting. Their lawyers made the criminal charges disappear through procedural challenges related to evidence collection and witness testimony, and Thompson was released on technicalities that seemed designed to prevent the case from going to trial. 3 weeks after his release, Thompson was found dead in his apartment, apparently from a heroin overdose that medical examiners determined had been administered with clinical precision. The timing was convenient for everyone except Thompson, who had been clean and sober for 12 years according to his military records and had never shown any signs of drug use during his employment with Pinnacle Security. The development projects moved forward on schedule, breaking ground in areas that had been cleared of gang activity through violence that the community viewed as random urban decay rather than orchestrated military operations. The territory that had once been controlled by the Diablos and Golden Dragons was now prime real estate, with construction crews building luxury condominiums and upscale retail spaces that would serve populations with significantly higher incomes than the previous residents. The remaining gang activity had been pushed into less valuable neighborhoods where development pressure was minimal and real estate investments would generate lower returns. Property values in the target areas doubled within 6 months, creating enormous profits for investors who had purchased land and buildings during the height of the violence when prices were artificially depressed. We never found the 9mm Glock that had killed 6 people, and we never identified the person or persons who had coordinated the systematic destruction of 2 major street crews. The investigation was closed due to lack of evidence, and case files were sealed by federal authorities who claimed national security concerns related to the investigation of private military contractors. But the streets remember everything, and the streets don't forget lessons learned through blood and violence. I still work gang intelligence, and I still patrol the same neighborhoods where the war played out during that week in March when everything changed. The luxury condos are full now, occupied by young professionals who have no idea their homes were built on territory that was cleared through military-grade violence designed to eliminate human obstacles to real estate development. The upscale restaurants and boutique shops do thriving business, serving customers who never knew about the bodies that had to be moved before gentrification could take root in neighborhoods that had been written off as permanently dangerous by city planners and investment analysts. Sometimes I drive past the spots where we found the victims, the basketball courts where Trips died, the dumpster where Kevin Park was found, the apartment building where Ramon Torino thought he was safe behind multiple layers of security that proved worthless against professional military tactics. The locations look different now, cleaned up and renovated with private security patrols and surveillance cameras that protect property values rather than human lives. But I can still see the crime scene tape in my mind, still remember the positions of the bodies, still feel the tension that filled the air when everyone knew a war was coming, but no one understood who was really fighting it. The gang infrastructure in the South Bronx never recovered from that 6-day war that destroyed organizations built over decades of careful territorial expansion and business development. The territory that had been controlled by established crews is now divided among dozens of smaller groups that fight constantly among themselves without understanding that their conflicts serve interests that have nothing to do with street-level concerns about respect, territory, or drug trade profits. Violence is actually higher now than it was when the major crews maintained order through disciplined hierarchies that could negotiate conflicts and enforce agreements that prevented unnecessary bloodshed. But it's disorganized violence that doesn't threaten development interests, random chaos that justifies increased police presence and private security measures that protect investment property. That's the thing about territory wars in modern urban America. Sometimes the winner isn't one of the crews fighting in the streets for control of corners and drug markets. Sometimes the winner is the entity that profits from the chaos, the organization that benefits when traditional power structures collapse and leave valuable territory available for redevelopment by interests with the resources and political connections necessary to exploit opportunities created through violence. And sometimes justice isn't about catching the killer or solving the case in ways that result in arrests and convictions. Sometimes justice is about understanding how the game is really played, who's making the rules that determine which neighborhoods get to survive, and which ones get cleared away for progress that benefits people who never lived there and never cared about the communities they destroyed. The bodies are buried, the cases are closed, and the condos are full of people who moved to the neighborhood because it's safe and convenient and profitable for investment purposes, But the war never really ended. It just moved to different streets, different neighborhoods, different crews that don't yet understand they're fighting an enemy they can't see and can't defeat with traditional street tactics. That's modern policing in the big city, not just dealing with crime and violence as random social problems, but navigating the intersection of law enforcement, politics, and economics that determines how communities live and die according to plans developed in boardrooms and government offices that ordinary people never see. Sometimes all you can do is count the bodies and try to understand the bigger picture, even when that picture is too ugly to look at directly and too complex to explain to people who prefer simple explanations for complicated problems. The Pinnacle security investigation revealed connections to similar operations in other cities where gang violence had suddenly escalated before major development projects began construction. Detroit, Baltimore, Oakland, Philadelphia, cities where established criminal organizations had been systematically destroyed through professional military tactics that left territories available for profitable redevelopment. The pattern was consistent across all locations. Sudden escalation of violence between established crews, elimination of leadership through precision killings, collapse of organizational structures that had maintained stability for years, followed by rapid gentrification that transformed dangerous neighborhoods into upscale residential and commercial districts. Federal authorities opened investigations into what they termed urban warfare contracting, but most of the cases were closed without arrests or convictions. The private military companies involved had sufficient political protection and legal resources to avoid prosecution, while the street-level soldiers who carried out the actual killings were eliminated before they could provide testimony that might have exposed the broader conspiracy. Marcus Thompson's death was officially ruled an accidental overdose, despite evidence that suggested he'd been murdered to prevent him from revealing information about his employers and their methods. The investigation into his death was closed after 3 weeks, with case files sealed under provisions of the Patriot Act that prevent disclosure of information related to national security investigations. But Thompson had managed to leave behind evidence that partially exposed the scope of the urban warfare contracting network. Hidden in his apartment was a detailed operational manual that described techniques for destabilizing criminal organizations through targeted violence, psychological operations, and manipulation of intergroup conflicts. The manual had been prepared by military intelligence specialists and distributed to private contractors working in multiple cities. It contained specific instructions for identifying key personnel in criminal organizations, developing operational plans for their elimination, and managing the aftermath of destabilization operations to ensure maximum benefit for development clients. The techniques described in the manual were being used in cities across the United States, with private military companies hired by real estate developers, municipal governments, and federal agencies that viewed criminal organizations as obstacles to urban renewal projects worth billions of dollars in combined investment. Gang members were being eliminated not because they were criminals who threatened public safety, but because they controlled territory that had become valuable for other purposes. The violence that destroyed their organizations was presented to the public as evidence of the need for increased law enforcement and private security measures that would protect the investment property built on the ruins of their communities. That's the reality of modern gang intelligence work. Understanding that street-level violence often serves interests that have nothing to do with the motivations of the people who are dying in wars they don't understand. The crews fight each other for territory and respect, while the real winners are entities with resources and political connections that can manipulate conflicts to achieve objectives that go far beyond anything the combatants can imagine. The box had been sitting in evidence storage room B for 23 years when I finally pulled it down from the shelf, dust cascading onto my uniform as I carried it to the interview room where 3 manila folders held the key to a case that had destroyed careers ended marriages, and left more questions than answers about what evil looks like when it wears a neighbor's face. I'm Officer Sarah Mackenzie, Albany Police Department Cold Case Unit, and I've been working unsolved murders for the past 10 years. Most cold cases stay cold for good reasons. Evidence gets contaminated by time and improper storage. Witnesses die or disappear into lives that have nothing to do with ancient crimes. Leads dry up and investigating officers move on to fresh murders that seem more solvable than puzzles that have defeated better detectives than me. But some cases call to you, demanding attention even when logic says they're hopeless. Even when supervisors suggest your time would be better spent on cases with better chances of closure. The Brennan family murders had been calling to me for 8 months, ever since I'd first read the original reports and seen crime scene photographs that still gave me nightmares. Patrick Brennan, 36, his wife Catherine, 34, and their daughter Emma, 8 years old, had been found murdered in their farmhouse outside Albany on a snow-covered morning in February 1987. No signs of forced entry, no obvious motive, no suspects, no witnesses, no useful evidence despite a 3-year investigation that had consumed thousands of hours and produced nothing resembling justice for 3 innocent people. Just 3 bodies in a house full of evidence that had never added up to anything resembling an explanation for why a happy family had been executed in their own home by someone who'd vanished without leaving any trace of identity or motive. The original investigation had been thorough by 1987 standards, conducted by Detective Frank Morrison, now retired and living in Florida, where he'd moved after the Brennan case broke his spirit and ended his career in law enforcement. Morrison was a good cop, careful and methodical, but he'd been working with technology and techniques that seemed primitive compared to modern forensic capabilities that could extract information from evidence that 1987 investigators couldn't even properly collect. DNA analysis in 1987 was limited and expensive, available only for the most serious cases, and even then producing results that courts often rejected as unreliable. Computer databases were basic, containing limited information that couldn't be cross-referenced with other agencies or jurisdictions. Cell phone records didn't exist because cell phones were luxury items for wealthy businessmen rather than communication tools that ordinary people carried everywhere. The investigative tools that we take for granted today, advanced forensic techniques, comprehensive databases, interagency communication networks, simply weren't available to Morrison and his team when they were trying to solve murders that might be routine cases today but were impossibly complex puzzles in 1987. But evidence doesn't deteriorate at the same rate that technology advances, and sometimes a case that seemed unsolvable in 1987 becomes perfectly clear in 2010 when you apply modern techniques to old evidence that was properly collected and stored by investigators who understood the importance of preserving material they couldn't analyze. I started by rereading Morrison's files, all 8 bankers' boxes of reports, interviews, photographs, and evidence logs that documented the most comprehensive murder investigation in county history. Morrison had interviewed over 300 people, followed dozens of leads across multiple states, and documented every detail with obsessive precision that suggested he'd known the case would be reviewed by future investigators with better tools. Patrick Brennan had been a successful insurance salesman with no known enemies, no business disputes, no personal conflicts that might have motivated violence against him or his family. He'd been well liked in the community, active in local organizations, financially successful without being ostentatious about his wealth. Catherine had been a part-time teacher and full-time mother with no involvement in anything that might have led to violence. She'd taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church, volunteered with the library reading program, and spent most of her time caring for Emma and maintaining the family home that had been their pride and joy. Emma had been a second grader who liked horses and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She'd been enrolled in gymnastics classes, played on a youth soccer team, and was considered one of the brightest students in her class by teachers who'd known her since kindergarten. The murders had shocked the rural community in ways that urban violence never could. This wasn't New York City or Albany, where crime was a daily reality. This was farm country, where people still left their doors unlocked and children walked to school without supervision. Finding an entire family executed in their own home shattered the sense of safety that small-town residents had taken for granted for generations. The crime scene had been brutal but organized, suggesting a killer who understood how to control multiple victims and manage a complex murder scenario without leaving evidence that could lead to identification. All 3 family members had been shot once in the head with a .38 caliber revolver, precise shots that indicated familiarity with firearms and comfort with violence. The killer had moved through the house systematically, first Catherine in the kitchen while she was preparing breakfast, then Emma in her bedroom where she'd been getting dressed for school, finally Patrick in the living room where he'd apparently tried to defend his family with a hunting rifle that he'd never had a chance to fire. But it was the details that didn't fit any obvious pattern that had frustrated Morrison and every other investigator who'd worked the case over the years. The killer had taken time to search the house, opening drawers and closets as if looking for something specific, but money and jewelry had been left untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. There were no signs of sexual assault, no evidence of personal grudges or business disputes that might have motivated the murders. The family had been living quiet, ordinary lives without enemies or secrets that could explain why someone would want them dead. Morrison's investigation had explored every possible angle with the thoroughness of a detective who understood that he might only get one chance to solve the case before public attention moved on to fresher crimes. Insurance fraud, Patrick's policies were legitimate and recent, with no irregularities that might have motivated murder for financial gain. Extramarital affairs, both Patrick and Catherine had been faithful spouses with solid marriages that showed no signs of the relationship problems that often lead to domestic violence. Financial difficulties, the family was comfortable without being wealthy, living within their means and maintaining savings accounts that showed no evidence of economic pressures that might have led to desperate actions. The physical evidence had been limited by 1987 technology that couldn't extract useful information from materials that modern forensic science can analyze with precision that would have seemed like magic to investigators working the case 23 years ago. Fingerprints had been collected from throughout the house, but most belonged to family members or frequent visitors who had legitimate reasons for being in the home. Blood spatter analysis had confirmed the sequence of murders, but provided no information about the killer's identity or physical characteristics. The .38 caliber bullets had been recovered in good condition, but without the weapon, ballistics comparison was impossible. The bullets had been fired from a revolver that was probably older and well-maintained, but that description could fit thousands of weapons owned by legal gun owners throughout the region. What haunted Morrison, and later haunted me, was the feeling that the killer had known the family personally, had understood their routines and habits well enough to plan the murders, with confidence that he wouldn't be interrupted or discovered until after he'd completed his work and escaped. The murders had been committed with efficiency that suggested familiarity with the house layout, knowledge of which rooms to search and which areas would provide the best escape routes if the plan went wrong. The killer had known where Patrick kept his hunting rifle, had anticipated Catherine's morning routine, had understood Emma's schedule well enough to find her in her bedroom rather than searching the entire house. But every friend, relative, and business associate had been investigated and cleared through alibis, polygraph tests, and background checks that revealed no connection to the murders. The Brennans had been well-liked people with strong community ties and no known enemies among the hundreds of people who knew them well enough to plan and execute the killings. After 3 years of investigation, Morrison had been forced to conclude that either the killer was a stranger who had selected the family randomly, which seemed unlikely given the personal knowledge demonstrated by the crime, or someone close to the family had been able to hide their involvement completely through careful planning and skillful deception. 23 years later, I approached the case with fresh eyes and modern tools that could extract information from evidence that Morrison had collected but couldn't analyze. The first step was re-examining the physical evidence using current forensic techniques that could reveal details invisible to 1987 investigators working with equipment that belonged in museums compared to modern crime laboratories. Blood samples that had been stored in the evidence room were tested for DNA profiles that couldn't have been generated in 1987, when genetic analysis was experimental science rather than routine forensic procedure. Fingerprints were run through databases that hadn't existed during the original investigation, databases that now contained millions of prints from criminals, military personnel, and civilian employees who'd been processed through systems that could identify matches across decades of law enforcement activity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a single hair fiber that had been collected from Patrick Brennan's hunting rifle and stored in an evidence envelope that had been sealed and forgotten for over 2 decades. In 1987, hair analysis was limited to microscopic comparison that could suggest possible matches, but couldn't provide definitive identification that courts would accept as proof of guilt or innocence. In 2010, DNA extraction from hair shafts had become routine, and the results were automatically entered into the combined DNA index system that connects forensic laboratories across the country and maintains genetic profiles from millions of criminals, victims, and evidence samples collected from unsolved cases. The DNA profile matched a sample in the database. Thomas Riley, 47 years old, currently serving a 20-year sentence in Auburn Correctional Facility for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Riley had been arrested in 2008 for a series of home invasions in Syracuse, and his DNA had been added to the database as part of the standard booking process for violent felons. But there was a problem that complicated what should have been a simple identification and arrest. In February 1987, Thomas Riley had been 24 years old and living in California, working construction jobs and maintaining a clean criminal record that showed no history of violence or criminal activity that might have predicted the brutal murder of an entire family. There was no obvious connection between Riley and the Brennan family. No reason why he would have traveled across the country to murder 3 people he'd never met. No evidence that he'd ever been to upstate New York before his arrest in 2008 for crimes that were completely unrelated to the 1987 murders. I drove to Auburn to interview Riley, expecting to find answers that would finally solve the case that had haunted law enforcement for over 2 decades. Instead, I found more questions and complications that suggested the truth was more complex than a simple DNA match could reveal. Riley was a small man, maybe 5'6" and 150 pounds, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of manual labor and substance abuse that had aged him beyond his years. He didn't look like someone capable of the cold-blooded execution of an entire family, but appearances can be deceiving in ways that experienced investigators learn not to trust. Riley denied any involvement in the Brennan murders, claiming he'd never been to upstate New York before his arrest in 2008 for the home invasion spree that had finally brought him to the attention of law enforcement. He seemed genuinely confused when I described the crime scene, and his alibi for February 1987 checked out through employment records that showed he'd been working a construction job in San Diego during the week the murders occurred. But DNA doesn't lie, and Riley's genetic material had been found on the weapon Patrick Brennan had tried to use to defend his family. Someone connected to Thomas Riley had been in that farmhouse on the night 3 people died. Someone who'd left behind evidence that would take 23 years to identify and analyze. The answer came when I started investigating Riley's family connections in New York, looking for relatives who might have had access to personal items that could have transferred genetic material to the crime scene. His older brother, Michael Riley, had lived in Albany in the 1980s. working as a mechanic and maintaining a low profile in the community that kept him out of police records and below the attention of law enforcement agencies that might have connected him to unsolved crimes. Michael had died in a motorcycle accident in 1994, 7 years after the Brennan murders, taking any direct knowledge of the crimes to his grave. But employment records showed a connection that Morrison couldn't have discovered in 1987. Michael Riley had worked at the same garage where Patrick Brennan had his car serviced, providing regular contact between the killer and his eventual victims. The garage's business records, stored in a warehouse in Syracuse, contained detailed information about every customer that had been collected over decades of operation. Patrick Brennan's file contained enough personal information to plan a burglary down to the minute. Home address, work schedule, family routine, notes about alarm system installation and security measures that mechanics had observed while working on the family's vehicles. The murders hadn't been random violence or personal vendetta motivated by psychological problems or personal conflicts. They'd been the result of a burglary gone wrong, when Patrick Brennan had unexpectedly confronted an intruder who was prepared to kill rather than risk identification and arrest for crimes that could have sent him to prison for decades. But that still didn't explain how Thomas Riley's DNA had ended up at the crime scene, 24 hours after his brother had murdered 3 people and fled the state to avoid investigation by law enforcement agencies that were already beginning to focus on the garage connection. The answer came from family interviews that revealed the brothers had been close, often sharing tools and equipment for their respective jobs, staying in each other's homes during visits that could last for weeks or months depending on work availability and personal circumstances. Cross-contamination of DNA evidence from family members was a phenomenon that wasn't well understood in 1987, but had become a recognized issue in modern forensic investigations. Thomas Riley's DNA had been an innocent transfer, not evidence of direct involvement in the murders that had destroyed 3 lives and haunted law enforcement for over 2 decades. Thomas had visited Michael in Albany several times during the 1980s, staying in his apartment and using his tools and equipment for construction projects that supplemented his income during periods of unemployment in California. Genetic material from Thomas had been transferred to items that Michael later brought to the Brennan farmhouse during the burglary that turned into triple murder. 23 years after the crime, I finally had answers for the families who had been waiting for justice, even though those answers couldn't bring back the dead or undo the damage that had been done to a community that had never recovered from the shock of losing an entire family to senseless violence. Michael Riley, the actual killer, was beyond prosecution. But the mystery that had haunted 3 families and an entire community had been solved through technology that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. The case could finally be closed, even though closure couldn't restore what had been lost or repair the lives that had been shattered by unanswered questions that had festered for over 2 decades. The case closure brought mixed emotions from everyone who had been affected by the murders and the investigation that had consumed so many resources without producing results that could satisfy the community's need for justice and understanding. Catherine Brennan's sister wept when I explained what had happened, grateful to finally understand why her family had died, but devastated to learn that the killer had escaped earthly justice and lived 7 more years after the murders without facing consequences for destroying 3 innocent lives. Patrick's brother was angry that Michael Riley had been able to continue his life while the Brennan family lay in graves that had been visited by relatives who spent decades wondering why their loved ones had been targeted for violence that seemed completely random and motiveless. Emma Brennan would have been 31 years old in 2010 if she'd been allowed to grow up and live the life that had been stolen from her by a burglar who decided that murder was preferable to leaving witnesses who could identify him to police investigators. She would have graduated from college, maybe become the veterinarian she'd dreamed of being, perhaps had children of her own who would have carried on the family legacy that died with her in 1987. Instead, she was 8 years old forever, another victim of a crime that had taken a lifetime to solve, and would never really be resolved in ways that could restore what had been lost or repair the damage that had been done to people who'd loved her. The Brennan case changed how our cold case unit approaches old evidence, establishing new protocols for retesting genetic material using current technology, cross-referencing DNA profiles with expanded databases that include millions of samples, and investigating family connections that might explain contamination or transfer of evidence between related individuals. But the case also reinforced something I'd learned from other long-delayed investigations. Closure isn't the same as justice, and understanding how and why a crime occurred doesn't undo the damage or restore what was lost when evil visited a family that had done nothing to deserve the violence that ended their lives. Sometimes, the best you can do is answer the questions that have been eating at people for decades, and hope that understanding brings some measure of peace to survivors who have been carrying burdens that were never theirs to bear. The investigation revealed that Michael Riley had been responsible for several other burglaries in the Albany area during the 1980s, using his access to customer vehicles to case homes and businesses for future crimes that were planned with the precision of someone who understood how to exploit the trust that exists between service providers and their clients. His death in 1994 had ended a criminal career that might have continued for decades if he'd been more careful about avoiding situations that put him at risk of accidental death or arrest by law enforcement agencies that were beginning to develop better techniques for connecting crimes that appeared unrelated. The garage where Michael had worked closed in 1995, and its owner moved to Arizona, where he died in 2003, without ever knowing that one of his employees had been using customer information to plan crimes that included the murder of an entire family. The building now houses a restaurant that serves the kind of upscale clientele that wouldn't recognize the location's connection to one of the area's most notorious unsolved crimes. I still drive past the Brennan farmhouse sometimes, when other investigations take me through that part of the county where rural properties sit on large lots that provide privacy and isolation that can be both blessing and curse, depending on the intentions of people who visit them. New owners have renovated the property extensively, adding modern security systems and landscaping that makes it look nothing like the crime scene photographs from 1987. They have no connection to the murders and probably don't know about the violence that occurred in their home 23 years before they bought it from relatives who couldn't bear to keep property that held so many painful memories. But I can still see the layout in my mind, still visualize how Michael Riley moved through those rooms on a February night when 3 people died because a burglar decided that murder was easier than finding a different target for his criminal activities. That's the burden of working cold cases. You carry other people's nightmares, and you never really let them go, even when you solve the puzzles and answer the questions that have haunted families and communities for decades. The crimes stay with you. The victims stay with you, and the knowledge that evil can visit anyone at any time stays with you in ways that change how you view the world and the people who live in it. Justice delayed isn't justice denied, but it's justice that tastes different when it finally arrives after decades of waiting and wondering and hoping for answers that might never come. 23 years is a long time to wait for closure. And sometimes those answers aren't worth the wait, because they can't restore what was lost or repair the damage that was done when evil visited a family that had never done anything to deserve the violence that ended their lives. But they're still answers. And for families like the Brennans, answers are all the justice they're going to get in a world where crime doesn't always make sense, and killers don't always face consequences that match the damage they've done to innocent people who trusted that their homes would be safe from the kind of violence that belongs in nightmares rather than real life. The case taught me that some crimes are solved not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensic techniques, but through the simple passage of time that allows technology to catch up with evidence that was properly collected by investigators who understood they might not live to see their cases resolved. Frank Morrison, the original investigator, died in 2012, without knowing that the case that had ended his career had finally been solved through technology that hadn't existed when he was collecting evidence that would eventually provide the answers he'd spent 3 years searching for. He'd done everything right, followed every lead, interviewed every possible suspect, and documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that future investigators might need to review his work with tools and techniques that didn't exist in 1987. His work made the solution possible, even though he never got to see justice served or answers provided to families who had trusted him to find the truth about what had happened to their loved ones on a February night when evil visited a farmhouse and changed 3 lives into 3 deaths. That's the reality of cold case investigation. Sometimes the answers come too late for the people who needed them most. And sometimes justice is a gift that gets passed from one generation of investigators to the next, until technology and circumstances align in ways that make the impossible suddenly possible. The milk was still cold when we found the abandoned farmhouse, and that detail would haunt me for years afterward, waking me up at 3 a.m. with questions that had no answers, and images that wouldn't fade no matter how many other cases I worked, or how much time passed between that September morning and the nightmares that still visit me when I least expect them. Fresh groceries scattered across the kitchen counter like someone had been interrupted mid-task. Coffee still warm in the pot with steam rising from 2 cups that had been partially consumed. A child's breakfast cereal slowly getting soggy in a bowl on the table next to a glass of orange juice that hadn't been touched. Everything suggested that the Morrison family had simply vanished mid-morning, leaving behind a life that was continuing without them. I'm Officer Jennifer Walsh, New York State Police, stationed out of Oneonta, and responsible for patrol coverage across 3 rural counties that most people couldn't find on a map without GPS assistance. It's beautiful country, rolling hills, pristine lakes, small farms that have been in the same families for generations, forests that stretch for miles without roads or houses or any sign of human habitation. It's also the kind of terrain where people can disappear without a trace, and sometimes do, swallowed up by wilderness that keeps its secrets better than any human conspiracy could manage. When someone vanishes in New York City, there are witnesses, security cameras, electronic records that create trails investigators can follow. When someone disappears in rural upstate, they might as well have fallen off the edge of the earth. The call came in at 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday in late September, during that perfect autumn weather when tourists drive up from the city to see foliage and experience small-town life that exists mostly in their imagination. Sarah Morrison, 32, had failed to pick up her daughter from elementary school, something that had never happened before according to the school secretary who'd known the family since Amy Morrison had started kindergarten 3 years ago. When attempts to reach Sarah by phone failed, the school had contacted her husband's workplace only to learn that Mark Morrison hadn't shown up for his shift at the county highway department, where he'd worked for 8 years without missing a single day, except for vacation time that had been scheduled months in advance. Missing adult cases usually aren't urgent in rural areas where people have legitimate reasons for changing their routines, and communication isn't always reliable, because cell phone coverage can be spotty and landlines get disrupted by weather or equipment failures. Most disappearances resolve themselves within 24 hours when missing persons turn up with simple explanations for why they couldn't be reached. But when an entire family vanishes simultaneously, especially a family with young children and strong community ties, every instinct developed over 15 years of law enforcement says something is seriously wrong. Something that goes beyond communication problems or routine emergencies that might require immediate travel without time to notify schools or employers. I drove out to the Morrison farm expecting to find simple explanations that would make this call another routine day in rural law enforcement. Maybe a family emergency that had required immediate travel to help relatives in crisis situations. Maybe a breakdown in communication that had left responsible people looking irresponsible through circumstances beyond their control. Maybe something mundane and explainable that would resolve itself once I'd talked to neighbors or found notes that explained where the family had gone and when they'd be back. The Morrison property was 15 miles outside Delhi, down a dirt road that wound through state forest land and private holdings that had been carved out of wilderness decades ago by families who'd wanted space and privacy more than they'd wanted convenience and proximity to urban amenities. The farmhouse sat in a clearing surrounded by mature hardwood trees, with a barn and several outbuildings that suggested the family raised livestock and maintained equipment for agricultural work that supplemented Marks County employment. My first impression was that everything looked normal, almost aggressively normal in ways that made me suspicious, because crime scenes and emergency situations usually show obvious signs of disturbance or hasty departure. The property was well maintained, with no signs of struggle or forced entry, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred to disrupt the family's morning routine. Mark Morrison's pickup truck was parked in the driveway next to Sarah's sedan, both vehicles clean and properly maintained in ways that suggested people who took care of their possessions and planned for the future. The front door was unlocked, which was common in rural areas where crime rates were low and neighbors looked out for each other, but it also meant that anyone could have entered the house without leaving signs of forced entry. But inside the house, details began accumulating that suggested something was very wrong, something that went beyond routine emergencies or communication problems that might have innocent explanations. Fresh groceries were scattered across the kitchen counter as if someone had been interrupted while putting them away after a shopping trip. A gallon of milk sat open next to the refrigerator, with enough spilled on the floor to indicate it had been dropped rather than set down carefully. The coffee pot was still plugged in and warm, with 2 cups on the counter that had been partially consumed before being abandoned. In the living room, toys were spread across the floor in patterns that suggested active play rather than cleaning up after recreational activities. A coloring book lay open on the coffee table, with crayons scattered around a half-finished picture of a horse that Amy Morrison had been working on when something interrupted her artistic efforts. The television was on, but muted, tuned to a children's program that would have been playing during morning hours when most families are getting ready for work and school. Upstairs, beds were unmade, but not in ways that indicated struggle or violent disturbance. Clothes were laid out as if the family had been preparing for a normal day. Work clothes for Mark, casual clothes for Sarah, school clothes for 8-year-old Amy. Everything suggested a typical morning routine that had been interrupted suddenly and without warning by something that had caused 3 people to leave their home immediately. The details that weren't there were as troubling as the ones that were present in ways that suggested careful observation rather than routine missing persons investigation. No packed bags, no missing clothes, no indication that the family had planned to travel or had prepared for extended absence from their home. Cell phones were plugged in and charging on the kitchen counter, which was unusual because most people carry their phones everywhere, especially parents with young children who might need to be contacted during emergencies. Purses and wallets were in their usual places, containing cash, credit cards, and identification that people would need for any kind of travel or extended absence from home. Car keys hung on hooks by the front door, and both vehicles had full gas tanks and no mechanical problems that might have prevented their use for transportation. Whatever had caused the Morrison family to leave their home, they hadn't taken anything with them, suggesting either emergency departure under circumstances that didn't allow time for preparation, or forced departure under circumstances that didn't allow choice about what to bring or where to go. I radioed for backup and began processing the scene more carefully, using techniques developed for crime scene investigation, even though there was no evidence that crimes had been committed. Missing persons cases in rural areas present unique challenges that don't exist in urban environments. Large geographical areas to search with limited personnel and equipment, populations that might not have much contact with neighbors for days or weeks at a time, and wilderness areas where people could hide indefinitely or dispose of evidence in ways that would prevent discovery for years or decades. The property itself offered clues about the family's routine and connections that might explain their disappearance or provide starting points for investigation. Mark Morrison raised cattle and hay on 50 acres under cultivation and another 100 acres of pasture land that had been in his family for 2 generations. Sarah worked part-time as a bookkeeper for local businesses, mostly from a home office that showed evidence of recent activity and current projects that she wouldn't have abandoned willingly. 8-year-old Amy attended Delhi Elementary School and was involved in 4-H activities that seemed to be the center of the family's social life, providing connections to other families and community organizations that might have information about the Morrisons' plans or activities on the day they disappeared. By all accounts, the Morrisons were exactly the kind of stable, community-oriented family that made rural communities thrive despite economic challenges and geographic isolation that drove many young families to seek opportunities in urban areas. Mark was a volunteer firefighter who'd served the community for over a decade. Sarah taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church and organized community events that brought neighbors together. And Amy was a straight-A student who wanted to follow her father into agricultural work, rather than leaving the area for college and career opportunities in cities. They had no known enemies, no financial problems, no personal issues that might have motivated voluntary disappearance or attracted unwanted attention from people who might wish them harm. Their disappearance didn't fit any pattern that experienced investigators recognized from previous missing persons cases or criminal investigations. The search began that evening and continued for 8 weeks, involving state police, county sheriff's departments, volunteer fire companies, search and rescue teams, and civilian volunteers from across the region who contributed thousands of hours to efforts that covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness and rural terrain. We used helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, tracking dogs trained to follow human scent trails, ground-penetrating radar that could detect buried objects or disturbed earth, and every other resource available for locating missing persons in terrain that could hide evidence indefinitely if searchers didn't know exactly where to look. We found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no personal effects, no signs that the Morrison family had ever left their property on foot or been transported from their home by vehicles that might have left tire tracks or other evidence that trained investigators could identify and follow. It was as if they had simply evaporated from their kitchen while putting away groceries on a Thursday morning in September, vanishing into air without leaving any trace that could explain what had happened to them or where they might have gone. The investigation expanded to include digital forensics, financial analysis, and background checks that went back generations to identify any connections or patterns that might explain the disappearance. Bank records showed no unusual transactions, no large withdrawals, no evidence of financial planning for extended travel or relocation to other areas. Phone records revealed routine calls to friends, family, and business associates, with nothing suggesting crisis or emergency situations that might have required immediate departure from their home. The last call from the Morrison house had been made at 8:30 a.m. on the day they disappeared, when Sarah had confirmed Amy's pickup time with another parent involved in a 4-H carpool arrangement. Social media analysis showed a family living normal, happy lives with no indication of distress, danger, or plans for travel that might explain their sudden absence from home and community obligations. Sarah's Facebook posts from the morning she disappeared included pictures of Amy getting ready for school and comments about plans for weekend activities that suggested normal family life continuing into the future. Mark's last text message had been sent to a coworker at 9:15 a.m., confirming their work schedule for the following day and discussing equipment repairs that would need to be completed before the weekend. The message was routine workplace communication that gave no indication of personal problems or emergency situations that might have required immediate attention. The case attracted media attention after local outlets picked up the story of an entire family vanishing without explanation, generating hundreds of tips from across the country and drawing amateur investigators who created elaborate theories about government conspiracies, alien abduction, and supernatural phenomena that supposedly occurred in rural areas where strange events couldn't be explained by conventional science. None of the tips led anywhere productive, and the sensational coverage made it harder to focus on legitimate investigative leads that might have provided useful information about the family's disappearance. Every strange light in the sky became a UFO sighting related to the Morrison case. Every unusual animal track became evidence of Bigfoot or other cryptid involvement. Every unidentified sound in the woods became proof that the Morrison family was being held captive by unknown forces. But good police work focuses on evidence rather than speculation, and the evidence in the Morrison case was stubbornly mundane, despite the extraordinary circumstances of an entire family vanishing without leaving any trace of their departure or destination. A family had been living normal lives in a normal house, following normal routines that connected them to their community and their obligations, and then they weren't there anymore. No signs of struggle, no indication of advanced planning, no clues about where they might have gone or why they might have left behind everything that mattered to them. 6 months into the investigation, we got our first real lead from an unexpected source that opened up an entirely new direction for the case. A prison inmate in Pennsylvania contacted the state police tip line, claiming to have information about the Morrison disappearance that included details that hadn't been released to the public or shared with anyone outside the investigation team. Most inmate tips are attempts to trade worthless information for consideration in their own legal cases. But this one included specific details about the scene we'd found at the Morrison house: the spilled milk in the kitchen, the warm coffee pot, the specific children's program that had been playing on the television when we'd arrived to investigate the family's absence. Information that suggested either direct involvement in the disappearance or contact with someone who had been inside the Morrison house after the family vanished and before law enforcement had secured the scene for investigation. The caller was Walter Crenshaw, 43, serving 12 years for armed robbery and aggravated assault in connection with a series of convenience store holdups that had terrorized small towns across Pennsylvania for 6 months before his arrest. He claimed that his cellmate, a man named Eddie Vance, had confessed to murdering the Morrison family and disposing of their bodies in a remote location somewhere in the Catskill Mountains. Eddie Vance had been released from prison 2 weeks before the Morrison family disappeared, after serving 10 years for manslaughter in connection with a bar fight in Albany that had resulted in the death of another patron during an argument over a pool game. He'd been living in a halfway house in Delhi while transitioning back to civilian life, participating in job training programs and meeting with parole officers who were monitoring his adjustment to life outside prison. The halfway house was less than 5 miles from the Morrison farm, and Vance had been working temporary construction jobs that gave him familiarity with rural properties and access to tools and equipment that could be used for crimes that required physical preparation and cleanup. According to Crenshaw, Vance had been burglarizing rural properties to support a drug habit that had developed during his incarceration, when prescription medications had been easier to obtain than they were on the outside, where he had no legitimate medical coverage or legal sources for the painkillers he'd become dependent on while serving his sentence. The Morrison house had been a target because it was isolated from neighbors who might witness criminal activity, and the family's routine made it predictable when the property would be empty and safe for burglary activities. Vance had planned to break in while Mark was at work and Sarah was dropping Amy at school, giving him several hours to search for valuables and prescription medications that he could sell or use himself. But something had gone wrong with the timing, and the family had returned unexpectedly while Vance was in the middle of searching their house for items that could be converted into cash or drugs. Rather than flee and risk identification by witnesses who could send him back to prison for violating parole, Vance had decided to eliminate the witnesses who could connect him to crimes that would result in life sentences under three strikes laws that enhanced penalties for repeat offenders. The confession described how Vance had forced the family at gunpoint to drive to a remote location in the mountains, where he'd killed all three family members and buried their bodies in graves that had been prepared in advance as part of his contingency planning for situations that might require permanent elimination of witnesses to his criminal activities. He'd driven the family's vehicles back to the farm, arranged the scene to look like the family had been interrupted during normal morning activities, and hitchhiked back to the halfway house where his presence was documented by staff members who could provide alibis for his whereabouts during the official time frame of the Morrison disappearance. Crenshaw's story was detailed and convincing, including information about the Morrison house layout and family routine that wouldn't have been available to someone who hadn't been inside the property or received information from someone who had direct knowledge of the crime scene. But there were problems with the timeline and logistics that didn't match other evidence we'd collected during the investigation. Eddie Vance was 5'6" and 140 pounds, hardly imposing enough to control three people simultaneously without assistance from accomplices who hadn't been mentioned in Crenshaw's account of the confession. The halfway house records showed that Vance had been accounted for during the morning hours when the Morrison family disappeared, participating in mandatory job counseling sessions that would have made it impossible for him to be at the Morrison farm during the time frame when the family was last seen alive. And most importantly, when we tracked down Eddie Vance for questioning about his alleged confession to crimes that could result in multiple life sentences, we discovered that he'd been dead for 4 months. Vance had overdosed on heroin in a Schenectady motel room in December, 5 months after the Morrison disappearance, and 3 months before Crenshaw claimed to have heard his jailhouse confession. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Vance had died alone, with no evidence of foul play or circumstances that might have allowed him to communicate information about the Morrison case to anyone before his death. The confession that Crenshaw claimed to have heard was impossible, unless Vance had been talking to his cellmate from beyond the grave, or Crenshaw had received information about the Morrison disappearance from sources he wasn't willing to identify during interviews with investigators who were trying to separate truth from fiction in a case that seemed to generate false leads faster than real ones. The false lead cost us valuable time and resources, but it also revealed something important about the case that suggested the truth might be more complex than a simple missing persons investigation could uncover. Details about the crime scene that should have been known only to investigators had somehow reached the prison population, suggesting either a leak in the investigation or contact between the real perpetrator and inmates who had access to outside information sources. We tightened security around case information and refocused the investigation on local connections that might explain how details about the Morrison house had reached people who shouldn't have had access to information that could compromise the investigation or generate false leads that wasted resources and confused the timeline of events. Rural communities are small, and disappearances don't happen in a vacuum that isolates them from the social and economic networks that connect families to their neighbors and communities. Someone had to have seen something, heard something, or known something that could explain what happened to the Morrison family on a September morning when 3 people vanished from their kitchen without taking anything with them or leaving any indication of where they'd gone. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction that opened up an entirely new theory about the disappearance. A property tax dispute that had been working its way through county court for 2 years revealed financial and political connections that hadn't been obvious during the initial investigation into the family's personal relationships and community ties. The Morrison farm sat on land that had been subject to eminent domain proceedings, as the state planned to expand a highway corridor that would require purchasing several properties in the area for road construction that was part of a federal infrastructure improvement project worth over $200 million in combined funding. Mark Morrison had been fighting the land acquisition through legal challenges that claimed the state's compensation offer was inadequate, and that losing the farm would destroy his family's financial security and connection to land that had been in the Morrison family for 2 generations. The legal battle had been contentious, involving lawyers, appraisers, and state officials who had grown frustrated with Morrison's refusal to accept what they considered a generous settlement that would have allowed the family to relocate to comparable property in other areas where land values were lower, and the compensation would have provided financial advantages. One of the state officials involved in the eminent domain case was Thomas Fletcher, a senior administrator in the Department of Transportation, who had been responsible for acquiring property rights along the new highway corridor and had received substantial performance bonuses based on his success in completing land acquisitions ahead of deadline and within budget constraints. Financial records showed that Fletcher had been receiving bonuses worth tens of thousands of dollars for each successful property acquisition, creating personal financial incentives for resolving disputes that delayed construction projects and threatened federal funding that required completion of land acquisition within specific timeframes. The Morrison farm was the last holdout in a corridor worth over $50 million in federal highway funding, and delays in completing the acquisition were threatening the entire project, along with Fletcher's reputation for delivering results that satisfied both state officials and federal agencies that controlled the funding streams. We discovered that Fletcher had been using private investigators to gather information about property owners who resisted land acquisition offers, documenting personal information, financial problems, and family issues that could be used to pressure reluctant sellers into accepting state offers without prolonged legal battles that delayed construction schedules. In the Morrison case, the private investigators had been conducting surveillance that included photographing the family's daily routines, documenting their work schedules, and identifying when the property would be unoccupied and vulnerable to activities that might encourage the family to reconsider their opposition to the state's acquisition offer. Information that would have been invaluable to someone planning a break-in, kidnapping, or other criminal activities that required detailed knowledge of the target's habits and vulnerabilities. But surveillance and intimidation are different from murder, and we still had no direct evidence connecting Fletcher to the Morrison disappearance beyond his financial interest in resolving the land acquisition dispute that was delaying his construction project and threatening his performance bonuses. The investigation might have stalled again if not for a discovery that changed everything and revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. Fletcher owned property in the Catskill Mountains that included abandoned mine shafts and quarries deep enough to hide bodies permanently, locations that matched the description in Eddie Vance's alleged confession, even though Vance had been dead when that confession was supposedly made. Ground-penetrating radar at Fletcher's mountain property revealed anomalies consistent with recently disturbed Earth in locations that corresponded to mine shaft openings that had been partially filled and camouflaged to look like natural terrain. When we excavated the sites, we found the Morrison family's remains buried in graves that had been carefully concealed to prevent accidental discovery by hikers or hunters who might venture into the remote areas. All 3 family members had been shot execution-style with a .22 caliber rifle that was found buried at the same location, along with personal effects that confirmed the victims' identities and provided evidence that connected the murders to Fletcher's financial interests in completing the land acquisition that had been delayed by the family's legal resistance. Ballistics analysis matched the weapon to Fletcher's gun registration, and DNA evidence from the burial site confirmed his involvement in disposing of the bodies after murders that had been committed by associates who specialized in solving problems that couldn't be resolved through legal or administrative channels. Thomas Fletcher was arrested 10 months after the Morrison family disappeared, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the systematic elimination of obstacles to state land acquisition projects that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding and private development opportunities. He confessed to hiring private contractors to intimidate the family into accepting the state's land acquisition offer, but claimed the murders had been unauthorized escalation by men he couldn't control once he'd set the process in motion. The contractors Fletcher had hired were military veterans who specialized in problem resolution for clients who needed results without asking questions about methods or consequences that might arise from activities that operated outside legal boundaries. They'd been paid to make the Morrison family disappear, permanently and without trace, clearing the way for immediate land acquisition and highway construction that would generate enormous profits for contractors and political benefits for officials who delivered infrastructure projects on schedule. Fletcher received life without parole for 3 counts of first-degree murder after a trial that revealed the systematic corruption of state land acquisition processes and the use of violence to eliminate citizens who exercised their legal rights to challenge government actions that threatened their property and livelihood. The contractors were never identified or arrested, despite extensive investigation by federal agencies that treated the case as domestic terrorism involving the murder of civilians by government-sponsored operatives. The investigation revealed that similar tactics had been used in other states, where infrastructure projects had encountered resistance from property owners who refused to accept compensation offers that officials considered adequate. The highway project was canceled after the murders were discovered, and the Morrison farm remains empty, slowly being reclaimed by forest growth that will eventually erase all evidence of the family that lived there and died because they'd trusted that legal resistance to government actions would protect them from violence that civilized societies aren't supposed to tolerate. The case taught me that rural missing persons investigations require understanding local politics and economic pressures that might not be obvious to investigators who focus on personal relationships and criminal histories without considering the broader context in which disappearances occur. Sometimes people don't disappear because of domestic problems, financial difficulties, or random criminal activity. Sometimes they disappear because they're obstacles to powerful interests that have the resources and political connections necessary to make problems go away permanently, using methods that leave no evidence except empty houses and families that are erased from existence as efficiently as entries in computer databases. I still patrol the back roads of rural New York, still respond to missing persons calls that usually turn out to be misunderstandings, communication failures, or family disputes that resolve themselves when missing persons are located and questioned about their failure to maintain contact with people who were concerned about their welfare. But the Morrison case changed how I approach investigations in agricultural communities, where land values and development pressures can make ordinary families targets for extraordinary violence that operates with government approval and professional execution that leaves no evidence except graves in remote locations that might never be discovered without specific information about where to search. The Morrison farm sits empty now, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, slowly returning to wilderness that will eventually reclaim the cleared fields and maintained buildings that represented 3 generations of family investment in land that had been their security and their legacy until it became valuable enough to kill for. Sometimes I drive past the property during night shifts, taking routes that bring me near the abandoned farmhouse where a family was eating breakfast one Thursday morning before they vanished forever. The windows are broken now, and the roof is starting to sag under the weight of snow and rain that accumulates without maintenance, but I can still picture the kitchen where someone interrupted their morning routine and changed 3 lives into 3 deaths. The house looks haunted in ways that have nothing to do with supernatural phenomena and everything to do with the knowledge that evil can wear official uniforms and carry government identification while committing crimes that destroy families and communities in service of interests that treat human lives as obstacles to be removed rather than citizens to be protected. That's the reality of missing persons cases in rural areas. Sometimes people disappear not because they want to leave their communities and families, But because someone else wants them gone and has the resources to ensure that they stay gone permanently, buried so deep in wilderness that they'll never be found by accident,